Hi and welcome into the course 7 Keys to Victory. In this course you will learn the 7 most essential guidelines for finding the right move in almost any chess position. Does it sound too good to be true? Well, frankly it will not make you a grandmaster or especially a world champion, but it definitely has enough power to advance your level of chess to 1-200 rating points above your current level and to bring yourself into the category of expert players. I'm Igor Smirnov from the Remote Chess Academy, and I'm really excited to start with this chess journey together with you. Now, what are those 7 keys to victory that I'm talking about here? These are the most fundamental rules of chess. There are plenty of the rules out there, but if we talk about the most core, most important guidelines of playing a chess game, there are not that many. In fact, there are only 7. I call them principles, and if you studied any of my previous courses, such as the Grandmaster's Secrets, the Grandmaster's Positional Understanding, or anything like that, then maybe you already know some of these principles. But nevertheless, whether you have already learned some of these principles or not, in any case, this course will be highly useful for you. First of all, there will be a lot of new ideas, and secondly, even if you're already familiar with some of these principles, it's not only important to know them, but also to bring yourself to the level of advanced players. The thing is, let me use an analogy with running. Like, everybody can run, but if you compare an ordinary person with a world champion or an Olympic champion in running, the Olympic champion has the skill developed to a much greater level, so he can run faster and his technique is a lot better. And it is the same thing with the chess skills. Like, even if you already possess a certain skill, well, if you possess it currently on the level of club players, you can still perfect it and bring it to the level of expert players, to the level of master players, and so on. And that is exactly what we're going to be doing in this course. It is not just a theoretical course, where you will learn a bunch of theoretical ideas. No, these are just 7 key principles, basically. But we will really work them out in details, and there will be a dialogue. I will be asking you the questions, and you'll be able to think yourself and to apply the knowledge that you learned right away in practice. Therefore, at the end of this course, you will not only learn these 7 key principles of playing the chess game well, but you will be able to apply them directly in your chess games right after you finish studying this course. You will learn them while studying the video lessons. You will also be able to practice them in the practical part of the course, and overall, I'm pretty sure that if you take it seriously, and even if you digest even only some fraction of this information, that will already be enough to advance yourself quite significantly in your chess development. Now let's talk about those 7 keys to victory and how they originated. In order to do that, let's go to the checkmate position and then we'll work it backwards. So we'll see what is a typical pattern of a chess game. Alright, so that's not a real chess game, it's just the scholar's mate, the fastest way to deliver a checkmate. And let's just realize in general what's going on. And then we'll see what are the general principles that guide the whole game of chess. So first of all, I've just made these few first initial very simple moves, and now white created already the checkmate threat. We want to capture the pawn on f7 and to deliver a checkmate. And let's say if black wants to cover his king additionally with the knight, then white will probably advance the pawn forward to kick away the knight and try to get to that f7 pawn and therefore to the king afterwards. Alright, again, that was not a real game, it's just the illustration of how the chess game can possibly come to the end. And now let's work it backward and see how should you play chess. First of all, the goal of a chess game is to checkmate the opponent's king. However, you can't do that directly because the king is covered by a lot of defenders, such as the pawns and the pieces. And therefore, before you get to the king, you have to attack and possibly capture all of those forces that surround the opponent's king, because they all are potential or existing defenders of the king. And that already formulates the goal of the chess game and also the first most important principle of the chess game, which is the principle of attack. It says that attacking moves are the best, and if you can attack anything in the opponent's position, do it. because anything, whether it be pawn or a piece or a king itself, anything is a good enough target for your attack. Alrighty, that was the first already very important takeaway. And now let's work it backward, because not always you can attack. So let's go to the very beginning of the game and see how the attack was created on the first place. Let's even go to the very beginning of the game. In order to do that, let's focus our attention on one piece for now, just on the bishop, and let's see how the bishop took part into the attack. It's just not to distract our attention for too many of the different factors. So originally, when the bishop was standing on its initial square, it was not doing anything. Of course, it is not attacking anything, it has no squares to go to. But when white advances the pawn forward to e4, now the bishop already controls this long diagonal. So that already makes the chances of this bishop to take part into the attack greater. If anything, any opponent's pawn or piece will ever appear on the diagonal of the bishop will be able to capture it. And therefore, by allowing the bishop to control greater quantity of squares, you maximize the chances of this bishop to take part into the attack. And in the next moves, once the bishop was advanced further to the c4, you realize that now the attacking potential of this bishop became even greater. Now, in addition to this initial diagonal, it starts controlling one more diagonal, and therefore it doubles the chances of this bishop to take part into the attack. So any opponent's piece or pawn or the king, if it ever appears under the fire of the bishop will be able to execute the attack, perhaps with the support of the other white pieces, like it happened here with the support of the white's queen. Now, so we can conclude how we can possibly prepare an attack. You prepare an attack by activating your pieces, by putting them on the positions where they control the greatest quantity of squares. I call this activity. And that formulates the second most important principle of the chess game, the principle of activity, which says that in order to prepare your attack, you need to put your pieces on the positions where they control the greatest quantity of squares. Therefore, there is the greater chance that sooner or later an opponent's item, such as piece, pawn or the king, will appear under the fire of this piece. And to summarize the whole thing, there are only two most essential ideas of a chess game. The first idea is that in order to win in a chess game, you need to attack. You want to attack the opponent's king, the pawns, the pieces, and actually anything. Anything in the opponent's position, you should try to attack and capture. If you can attack right away, that's the great thing. If you can't attack, then you need to prepare it by increasing the activity of your pieces, in other words, by putting them to the positions where they attack the greatest quantity of squares. By the way, the same thing happened, as you can notice, with the white's queen. Originally it was on the d1, was doing nothing, then it was advanced to f3, where it was starting to control a number of squares, and therefore it could also take part into the attack. So those are the two most important principles of the chess game: principle of attack and principle of activity. Essentially, that's it. You already know the entire chess strategy. But of course, it's not the end of the story, because there are different situations and there are different ways to execute these two most fundamental ideas of a chess game. And we'll talk about in the next lessons. We'll see what are those keys and how exactly you can follow these two most essential ideas of a chess game. I'm looking forward to talk to you in the lesson number 1, where we will discuss the first key to victory. Welcome into the first key to victory, and this lesson is called Key to Breakthrough. Here we'll analyze the first and most important principle of playing a game of chess. In fact, you already know this because we have just discussed it already. This principle is the principle of attack. It is a very straightforward idea. It means that if you can attack, you can do it. And let us just quickly review the example that we have already seen in the previous lesson, just to realize what are the purposes of the attack. So real quickly, let's just summarize. And again, we'll start from this primitive example, and then we'll go to more complex levels up to the level of the top grandmasters. Alright, so first of all, we notice that the reason for the attack, the goal of the attack. The first goal is to attack an opponent's king. Like in this position, white is going to checkmate it. That's the most straightforward goal. The next goal is to capture a certain material. some defenders of the king, such as the pawns, or in case if, let's say, the knight covers the king, we can attack the knight and we're gonna grab the knight. So that is the third goal of the attack. So as you can see, we're willing to attack the king, the pawn, or the knight. We're willing to either checkmate an opponent's king or to grab a certain material. In addition to that, there is one more reason for making attacking moves. In that particular position that we have now, even though this is the imaginary position, but anyway, right now the knight cannot go away because the black's king will be checkmated after queen takes f7. But let us just take a step back and imagine that the knight can go back. So let's say, change the position a little bit. I'll make a move for white knight to e2 and black castles. And now if white pushes pawn to e5, now the knight can retreat. It actually has to retreat. And that is the third reason for making attacking moves. It may force an opponent to decrease his activity, to go back, to retreat, to worsen his position to some extent. After pushing the pawn to e5, the knight will be forced to go back to e8. And that is certainly an advantage for white, because here on the f6 the knight was standing on an active square, it was controlling a lot of squares of the chessboard, and after it has to retreat back to e8, now you see that it's totally locked there, it doesn't have any square to go to, and it is totally passive. And we said that the second most essential principle, fundamental principle of playing a game of chess is the principle of activity. It means that you gotta put your pieces on the squares where they control greatest quantity of squares of the chessboard. And therefore, if you can decrease the activity of your opponent, force him to place his pieces on the passive positions, that is your accomplishment. Just to quickly summarize it, there are three main goals for the attack. The first goal would be to attack an opponent's king, hopefully to checkmate it. The second goal is to attack opponent's material, such as the pawns or the pieces. And the third goal is to gain in activity, to force an opponent to go back. So those are the three main goals of the attack. And now let's think of how you can find the right attacking moves. Let's take a few steps back and just realize exactly how you should be thinking during a game of chess so that you can find attacking moves. Alright, as you already know, we're going to attack some objects in the opponent's position. And naturally, at the very beginning of the game, you can notice that all of the opponent's pieces are standing on those two last ranks. And even though in the following moves the opponent will start bringing his pieces forward, they will still, in most of the cases, will be situated on the opponent's half of the board, on the last four ranks of the chessboard. And therefore, if you wish to attack opponent's pieces or pawns or his king, in any case you need to attack some objects on opponent's half of the board. And therefore, in order to find an attacking move, you need to focus your attention on opponent's half of the board and ask yourself how can you play there or attack something there on opponent's territory. That's exactly what white did in this particular example by pushing his pawn forward from e4 to e5. So white pushed the pawn forward and attacked something on opponent's half of the board. So that is the first most important principle of thinking during a game of chess. You look at the opponent's half of the board, you think how you can make some damage there. Alright, aside of that there is one more secondary helpful idea for finding attacking moves. Let's just quickly review once again what kind of attacking moves and what are the goals of the attack. So we said that there are only a few goals, and therefore you can easily recognize what kind of attacking moves actually exist. So the first thing we said that we attack opponent's king, we want to attack opponent's king. And if we attack opponent's king, it usually means that we make check. So that is the first forcing move, as we call it. It means that it forces an opponent to defend, to do something about it. So the first kind of the forcing move is a check. The second kind of forcing move is capture. Imagine that black ignores the threat to this knight, and so on the next move white will be able to grab the knight to capture it. This is the second kind of the forcing move, the capture. Capture of opponent's knight, capture of opponent's pawn, or anything. And the third kind of attacking moves, those are just attacking moves. It's exactly like the white's recent move pawn e4 to e5 where it attacks the opponent's knight. It does not capture it, but it attacks it and it forces an opponent to retreat, to go back, to defend. So those are the three kinds of attacking moves: the checks, the captures, and forcing moves, attacking moves. And therefore, just to summarize the whole thing, in order to find attacking moves, you need to keep in mind those two ideas. The first idea is that you need to usually go to an opponent's half of the board, or at least attack opponent's half of the board. And the second thing is that mostly you need to pay attention to forcing moves, which are attack of the king, which is check, attack of the piece, which is capture, and just attacking move. So checks, captures, and attacking moves. If you keep in mind just those two little ideas, the idea of going to opponent's half of the board and forcing moves, you will be able to find attacking moves easily in all the positions. And now let's go to more complex practical examples and see how this general theory works in practice. Here's the first practical example. The black player is Tal, the former world champion and one of the greatest masters of attack in history of chess, and the white player is Khalmov, also a strong grandmaster. Now it is black to play, and you may think about this for a second and try to recognize yourself what is the move that you would play here as black. And of course you know that. The first rule of chess says that if you can attack, do it. So your first idea should always be thinking about the attack. And we know how to do that. You gotta focus your attention on opponent's half of the board and ask yourself, how can I move my pieces forward into opponent's half of the board and take or attack something there? If you ask yourself this right question, then you can easily find the right move, rook to d3. The rook goes inside of the white's camp and starts attacking something. Particularly it attacks the white's pawn on c3. Now, if white would protect this pawn somehow, just play something like rook to c1, for instance. Even though at the moment black didn't gain anything particular, but still you can see the great difference that happened over the last move in the position. Black managed to activate his rook to bring it forward, where it's more active than it used to be, while the white had to use his rook for such a passive defensive role, where it does nothing but only protects that little pawn on c3. So in that case, that would help black to gain in activity, and therefore black managed to get a certain advantage out of his attack. In the actual game, instead of playing rook to c1, white decided to grab the black's pawn on b5, and here black found another brilliant attacking move. He actually made a forcing move, rook takes f3. Remember, we always get to check the captures, checks, and attacking moves. And here black found the capture, which is really advantageous for black. It turns out that by playing rook to d3, black did not only attack the pawn on c3, but he was also prepared an attack of the white's king, which could start from that sacrifice of rook takes f3. And white missed that idea, and black managed to execute it, to attack the white's king, which is the best thing you could do because it would just win the game. And here it turns out that if white just grabs the rook, then what's happened next? Well, black can continue the attack. He plays rook to g8 check. If the king goes away, black recaptures the pawn on b5 because that enables black to grab this pawn on f3 on the next move. And all of a sudden white is defenseless. If the queen tries to protect the pawn, which is probably the only way to do that, black can just continue the attack on that pawn, and now there is simply no defense against bishop takes f3, and that's gonna be a checkmate. Now in this game you can see all of those ideas that we discussed in theory, and you can notice how they work in practice. Let us just review this whole game real quickly, and once again, just pay attention to the way of thinking to find the right attacking moves. You focus your attention on opponent's half of the board, and you ask yourself, what forcing attacking moves can you play there? With that in mind, like play rook d3, going into white's half of the board, attacking the pawn, and after that he made a forcing move, rook takes f3, capture. He captured something on the white's territory, and after that black continued to attack the white's king. There was a check, and on the next move c takes b5 with an attack of the white's king once again, and finally after queen to d1, black once again went forward with queen to f4, threatening the pawn, and white was defenseless. So that just shows the right way of thinking, and as you can see, the brilliant Tal, the greatest master of the attack, played this great game, demolishing his opponent. But if you understand the right way of thinking, you can see that it is so easy for you to be the same great master of the attack. Here's another task for you. It is a game between Karius and Rogozin, two grandmasters. It is white to play. Now think about this position and try to find the attacking move for white here. I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. By the way, it's pretty cool that in the actual game white did not find the right move, even though if you understand how to think properly, it's pretty obvious that this is really the first move that you should be considering even in this position. By the way, if you ask yourself how can you go into opponent's half of the board, that is actually the only way possible for white to play here. Alright, so that is the move queen goes to b7. Again, that's simply the only way for white to go into the opponent's camp. And that is the attacking move, because it attacks both the bishop on e7 and the pawn on c6. And since black cannot protect both of those objects simultaneously, on the next move white will be able to grab one of them. Most likely black will protect the bishop, and therefore white will simply collect the pawn. We will not look at this game till the end. I mean, that was a long game, and actually, as I said, in the actual game white even missed this attacking opportunity, even though the white player was a strong grandmaster. So now you can already see that if you understand the right way of thinking, it's so easy to find the proper attacking moves. Now let's have a look at one more game. This time it was between two amateur players. One is with the rating 2250 and the black player is rated 1600. Alright, so there we go through the first moves. Just both opponents develop his pieces. Knight c6 attacking the queen, bishop b5 beating the knight, knight c3. So far everything was pretty normal. And let's start from here. It is white to play, and please think about it. How would you play here as white? Is there any way for you to start attack right here? And you know, we want to push forward, we want to move our pieces or pawns forward and attack something in the opponent's position. And of course we pay attention to forcing moves mostly. By the way, how about the move bishop takes c6? Is this the forcing move? Well, yes, it is a forcing move because it's check, but it will not give you any advantage, right? So you do not checkmate opponent's king, you do not win any material, you do not gain anything in terms of activity. And therefore, we play the attacking or forcing moves only if they give you a certain advantage. Otherwise, there is no need to play them. Otherwise, they are just useless. And therefore, bishop c6 is not the way to go here. We gotta find something else. And one more way for white to go forward to the opponent's half of the board is the move pawn to e5. And that is exactly what he played in the actual game. That attacks the opponent's knight, and therefore it forces opponent to do something about that. Now, first of all, let's quickly check what would happen if black would simply take that pawn, which is the most obvious way to react. Now white would probably need to do something about his queen, so he will take it on d8. Black has to recapture by the king because the knight is pinned. After that, since white just lost the pawn, he has to take it back. So he first needs to eliminate the defender of that pawn on e5, and on the next move to capture it. Now you can evaluate the situation. At the end of this line, white is attacking the two pawns in the black's camp, and the black's king is on a somewhat dangerous position, and therefore, even though it's not the end of the game, of course, but still white is in a favorable situation. And in the actual game, black did not want to do that, so let's take a few steps back to the original game. In the actual game, after white pushed his pawn forward to e5, black, instead of capturing this pawn, decided to move his knight from the attacked square, and he played knight to d5. Now, here's a question for you. At this point, white can take the black's knight on d5, and after black recaptures, grab that pawn with a queen. Should white go for that line? What do you think? Here it's important to mention one very straightforward chess rule. It says if you can take something, do it. If you can grab the opponent's material, that's great. Remember, that's one of the most essential ideas of the chess game. That's the idea of the attack, that you should be attacking opponent's king and capturing his pawns and pieces. Whatever material advantage you can gain, that is great. By the way, here one note to be made. When I say if you can take something, do it, I'm talking about winning the material. So for instance, the move bishop takes c6 you also capture something, but it does not provide you with any material advantage. It's only an exchange because the opponent would recapture that bishop. That is why that exchange is useless for white. You should only take if you can win the material, such as after the exchange on d5. After pawn takes, here you can grab this pawn by playing queen takes d5, and that's awesome. In addition to winning the pawn, white is now threatening to grab the knight on c6 and to win one more pawn after that exchange. So black protected it with the move queen to c7. Now here's another little question for you. Should white be taking the pawn on d6? What do you think? Remember, we should grab the opponent's material if we can win the material, but we should not just trade off the pieces for no reason. And in that case, if white would take on d6, black would just recapture with his bishop. So that does not win the material. And therefore, instead of doing that, white increased the pressure by playing bishop to f4. White is attacking once again. And now, he's really threatening to grab that pawn on d6 on the next move. Black replied with bishop e6, hitting the white's queen. And here, although at the first sight it looks like the queen should go back, but there is instead a better thing that white can do. Instead of that, you can apply the same way of thinking and ask yourself what kind of attacking moves can you play on opponent's half of the board. And in that case, white can actually make a counter blow. White can grab that pawn on d6 to realize his threat, because that pawn in turn would attack the black's queen. Here there is another important remark to be made. If we think about the black's move bishop to e6, was that an attacking move or not? Well, at first sight, it was, because it really attacked the white's queen. But remember, we talked about the power of attacking moves, that they should be giving you a certain advantage. Either you attack opponent's king or his material, or you gain in activity. And when we talk about gaining in activity, it means that you move your pieces forward and attack your opponent, while at the same time you force an opponent's pieces to go back to more passive positions. So in this case, if black would play bishop e6, and that would force the white's queen to go back somewhere, to e4 for instance, or anywhere, we would say that bishop e6 was really an attacking move. It forced white to retreat, to do something that he does not want to do. But in this case, the bishop e6 was useless, because actually white was not forced to retreat. He could make a counter blow instead, and that is what white did. White took the knight on c6 first, and then he grabbed that pawn on d6 with a counter attack of the black's queen. And therefore we may just conclude that bishop e6 was not effective. And that's important remark to remember, that we should be making attacking moves, that's true, but we should be only making attacking moves if they provide you with a certain advantage. Otherwise, this attacking move simply does not work, and then you should not be doing that. You should instead prepare a more powerful attack in the future. Alright, let's just finalize this force in line. Black captured white's queen, white did the same with the black's counterpart. And here we can just evaluate the resulting position. White is 2 pawns up. One of those extra pawns is this strong passed pawn on the c7, supported by the white's bishop on f4, and white has a clearly winning position thanks to his material advantage. In the future he won this game within just a couple moves. We'll not observe this game till the end. If you wish, in the additional materials you can find the complete game and review it yourself. Now let's draw the final conclusion about the first key to victory, which is the attack. First of all, the very straightforward rule says that attacking moves are the best. If you can attack, do it. Now, how do you find attacking moves? When it is your turn, first of all, you need to focus your attention on opponent's half of the board and ask yourself this magical question: how can I go forward to opponent's half of the board and take or attack something there? It's important to notice here that while going to opponent's half of the board, you're looking for a certain advantage that you can gain. It's not that you just go there for the sake of going there. No, you want to gain a certain particular advantage. What kind of advantage can it be? Well, there are only a few possible targets of your attack. The first target is opponent's king. Maybe you want to attack the king. The next target is maybe you want to attack opponent's piece or pawn, and that is the material factor. And the third possible target is when you want to gain in activity. If you can push your piece or pawn forward and force an opponent to retreat, for instance, if in this position black would just retreat back to g8, that's exactly the example of gaining inactivity. You pushed your pawn forward, you force an opponent to go back. That is how you gain greater advantage in activity. And that is the third reason for attack, the third goal of the attack. So you can attack opponent's king, you can attack opponent's material, or you can gain inactivity. Those are the three goals of your attack, the three possible advantages that your attack can bring to you. And therefore it's also important here to notice that oftentimes the attacking moves are also the forcing moves. They force a certain particular reply of your opponent. And the three kind of forcing moves that we know, they are checks, captures, and attacking moves. So always look for those kind of things and you will be able to find strong attacking moves. And I just took a move back. So once again, the most critical thing that you should remember out of this lesson, the key takeaway, is the right way of thinking for finding attacking moves. So when it is your turn, you're playing a game, you should first of all check if you have an effective attacking move. For that, you focus your attention on opponent's half of the board and you ask yourself what checks or attacks can you play there. In this particular position that we have now on the screen, in fact there were only two eventual attacking moves, which are bishop takes c6, the forcing move, and pawn to e5. And bishop takes c6 was just an exchange, black would recapture, it would not give you any advantage. And therefore white pushed the pawn to e5, which was enough to provide him with the winning advantage just within a few moves. That's the way to go. Not always you have an effective move, but if you have it, an effective attacking move, but if you have it, just do it. And if you don't have an effective attacking move, we'll talk about that situations in the following lessons.